starting in verse 13. Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Jesus replied, "Man, who appointed me a judge or arbiter between you?" Then he said to them, "Watch out. Be on guard against all kinds of greed. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions." And he told them this parable. The ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. He thought to himself, "What shall I do? I have no place to store my crops." Then he said, "This is what I'll do. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store my surplus grain. And I will say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry." But God said to him, "You fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? This is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich towards God." Then Jesus said to his disciples, "Therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat, or about your body, what you will wear. For life is more than food, and the body more than clothes. Consider the ravens, they do not sow or reap, they have no storeroom or barn, yet God feeds them. And how much more valuable you are than the birds. Who of you by worrying can add a single hour to your life? Since you cannot do this very little thing, why do you worry about the rest? Consider how the wild flowers grow. They do not labor or spin. Yet I tell you, not even Solomon in all his splendor was dressed like one of these. If that is how God clothes the grass of the field, which is here today, and tomorrow is thrown into the fire, how much more will he clothe you, you of little faith? And do not set your hearts on what you will eat or drink. Do not worry about it, for the pagan world runs after such things, and your Father knows that you need them. But seek his kingdom, and these things will be given to you as well. Do not be afraid, little flock, for your Father has been pleased to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions and give to the poor. Provide purses for yourself that will not wear out, a treasure in heaven that will never fail, where no thief comes near and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also."
Oh, hey everyone. It's great to see you again this afternoon. Welcome to those who have joined us for the open day today. It would be really helpful if you've got a Bible in front of you to keep that passage open that we just had read for us. Well, I grew up in what I think could fairly be described as a middle-class Australian family. My mum and dad both had the opportunity to do a university degree. Mum's a teacher, dad studied agronomy, which is a plant scientist for those who weren't sure. Dad went on to receive his PhD. Mum and Dad, when they got married, they rented initially. They ended up buying a small house, and then they slowly upgraded as they had an expanding family. There were 4 of us kids. And thankfully, as I think back, Dad was never without work. Mum had part-time work and sort of fitted that around looking after us kids. And I think, as I think back from my parents, one of the major kind of financial shocks for them came when us kids hit university. We were fairly closely spaced. We didn't live in a university town, and so they had to send us off. We did the HECS debt thing, but they had to pay college fees, kind of accommodation, food. It was a significant financial drain and something that I don't think they were totally prepared for. But after that, that's some time in the past. They've now recovered from that financial cost. They'd had to go at the investment property thing. I don't think that worked out very well for them. Dad, I think, has a decent amount of super stored up, though, for the future. And as I think through my family history and that kind of preparation for the future that my parents did, the experiences that they went through, they're not my only influence. I'll talk about some other influences as we look at the Bible together this afternoon. But they're a significant influence as I think about decisions that Jay and I are making right now for our future. We're in a different situation, but we want to be prepared. We don't want that financial shock when our kids hit that age where they might go to uni. It was a blessing for us to have that opportunity. We're keen to provide that for them. If we ever start talking about financial properties, I'm a little bit nervous because of my parents' experience. And as I think about my parents and the influence that it's had on me, and as I kind of think those questions into the future, it does raise for me the question, how do you actually go about preparing so that you will be okay? How will these decisions that I and our family are making now, how will they affect us now and into the future? Is it even the right way to think about things? And I imagine that many of you here this afternoon, you've probably thought a whole lot more about these sorts of questions. But it would seem to me that the more deeply you think into those types of questions, the more unstable you realise that it all actually is. Just this last week, I was reading a newspaper article that was on ABC Online. It was an opinion piece written by an Australian social researcher. His name is Hugh Mackay. And the article was written about the fact that we live in this country, Australia, that arguably is one of the greatest countries you could live in on the earth, on the planet at the moment. And yet, Australians, in Hugh Mackay's words, are in the grip of epidemics of anxiety, obesity and depression. Hugh Mackay states statistics that each year 20% of Australians will be affected by some sort of mental health issue. And as Hugh Mackay tries to unpack and wrestle through this kind of strange dichotomy, one of the things that he raises is what he calls the three big threats that we face in our country. I'm trying to remember them now. The three big threats, one of them was international terrorism, the second one was climate change, and the third one was the threat of a major global economic crisis. And I don't know about you, but I feel that last one. I mean, when you've got countries like America kind of printing money to get themselves out of trouble, where you have currencies that are no longer tied to gold or any other resource to kind of keep them in check, it would seem that it's only a matter of time until that does actually happen. Even here in Australia, there's talk about overinflated house prices being driven up by increasing personal debt. And it would seem that no matter how prepared you are in a financial sense, it's very hard to get yourself in a position where you're totally ready for whatever might come in the future. And as you kind of think about that, it does raise the question, where could you find stability instead? Someone might rightly raise that we shouldn't actually put our trust in money. What's important in life is really relationships. Friends, family, loved ones. I'm pretty sure it was a grandparent of mine that drummed into me that what you want on your deathbed is you want to be surrounded by people who love you. That is the thing that matters. Another saying that was in my family was, money isn't everything. But I don't know if you've thought about relationships. The problem is the more significant that relationships become for us, the more weight we place on our relationships, the more that our life and our happiness are tied to those relationships, the more unstable they actually become. They can't actually hold that kind of weight. Well, as Ben mentioned at the beginning, we're working through a series at Make at the moment called Team Jesus. We're thinking, as that video at the start talked about, the fact that with Team Jesus there's no kind of sitting on the sideline. We're either with Jesus on the field, actively engaged, or we're on the opposition. That is the picture. And as you kind of think through the instability of money, as you think through the instability of relationships, well, it maybe opens us to thinking about where else we might find that kind of stable ground to stand on. If money's unstable, if relationships are unstable, where is something that is not so fragile? It might open us to thinking through Team Jesus. And so really the question this afternoon that I want to ask is, what is the treasure for those who are on Team Jesus? What does he say that we ought to treasure? What's the main thing, the vital thing, the kind of storehouse which we can go to in tougher times if we are those who are on Team Jesus? How do we go about treasuring the kind of things that Jesus speaks to us about? Well, let's pray and we'll come to look at God's word together. Loving Father, we do thank you that you speak to us. Father, we thank you that you have reached out to us in sending your word, in sending your Son. And Father, we pray for your mercy this afternoon. Lord, may you move amongst us by your Spirit. Lord, we desire to know you, and we pray that you might burn with the fire of your presence amongst us. And we pray that in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, as we've considered the last few weeks, Team Jesus, as Ben mentioned, we're working through the middle chapters of Luke's Gospel, which is a biography of Jesus' life written by Luke. He's a doctor. We've talked about the fact over the last 2 weeks that in these middle chapters, Luke 10 to chapter 19, Jesus himself is on a journey. He's moving from Galilee, where he grew up and did most of his earthly ministry. He's on a journey down to Jerusalem, where he will ultimately face his death. And the invitation that is really coming to us in this series, Team Jesus, is to join Jesus on this journey as he heads to death and only then on into glory. And one of the things that we've seen over the past 2 weeks that as people are confronted with the person of Jesus, as they kind of have this invitation onto his team, there's various obstacles that people face to joining that team. Last week we saw a group of people for whom other people's opinion of them was one of those obstacles. They were very concerned what other people thought. They wanted to follow the rules so that people thought well of them. They forgot about the fact that God can actually see the inside. He can see the heart. He can see the mind. They weren't actually prepared for that day when God will come as judge. And this week, as we kind of move on through Luke's gospel, we get to see another obstacle that will stand in front of the potential player on his team, and that is money. Pick it up in chapter 12, verse 13, as Jesus continues to engage with this crowd that has gathered around him on this journey to Jerusalem. Luke 12:13. Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." And really for Jesus, as he confronts this situation, it's not an unusual situation in first century Judaism. Often people would come to the teacher, the rabbi, the person who knew the law, and seek their guidance on issues of inheritance. God had written much about this in the Old Testament, and so this is not a surprising situation. And yet what is surprising is, as you read on, to see Jesus' response to this man. Verse 14. Jesus replied, "Man, who appointed me a judge or an arbiter between you?" And then he said to them, "Watch out. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions." Jesus here refuses the man's request. He then goes on and warns him, tells him to watch out for greed, suggesting that that is actually what has motivated this question. And then we'll see from verse 16, he goes on to tell a parable which is essentially being told against this same man. Why is Jesus so harsh with him? Well, as you go back and look at verse 13 and see what this man is actually doing, it becomes a little bit more obvious what's going on. I mean, as this man comes to Jesus, he doesn't tell Jesus any of the circumstances of this inheritance being divided up. He doesn't come to Jesus asking for what God's law says. In fact, he doesn't even mention God's law at all. Now, what he's doing as he comes to Jesus is he's really using the credibility that Jesus has as a rabbi and as a teacher, and he's wanting Jesus to kind of use that credibility for this man's benefit, that he might come out on top in the issue of this inheritance. But you see here that Jesus sees right through this. And I want us to see, as you look at verse 15 there, I want us to see how Jesus is kind of drawing this line from this man's words, from this man's actions potentially, and he's drawing a line right down into his heart. He says there to him, verse 15, "Watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed." And what Jesus is saying here as he speaks to this man, as he draws this line in this man's heart, he's talking about the fact that his motive, the thing that has driven him is greed. Greed is just the want for more, wanting, desiring more than one's lot. Whenever we kind of want more, we can never store up enough of this thing. Wherever we find ourselves wanting more and more of some particular thing, that is our treasure. That is the thing that we are storing up and trusting and putting our hope in, the thing that we can never have enough of. That is what has captured our heart. And I do want to ask the question, how do we know what our treasure is? How do we test our treasure? The thing that we are greedy for. You'll notice there in verse 15 that Jesus speaks about guarding against all kinds of greed. Well, I think when you think about that, it's not actually that complicated. When you think about the words that you speak, the actions that you perform, maybe particularly those actions that you are surprised yourself about, to trace them back and to think back, where are they coming from? What are they being driven by? Are they being driven by that desire for safety, security and control? Are we instead saying the things that we're saying because we want people's acceptance? We want their affirmation. We want the relationship. That is our treasure. Maybe we're being driven by comfort, our food and our drinks and our pleasures. Or maybe it is that we are being driven by success, achievement, power, money, recognition. That is the thing that we are storing up and putting our hope and trust in. And as you look at what Jesus says there in verse 15, it would indicate to us, as he speaks about greed, which is particularly tied in with money, that he's really saying to us that we can watch where our money goes, where our money flows most easily, and then we will see where our treasure is, wherever our money is flowing to. I mean, if it is the security thing, is it that we desire to have that big kind of pot of money, that is the thing that is our confidence? Or is it to those comforts that our money flows? Or if it's the power and recognition, is it that we're investing and continuing to spend more money on the study and maintaining that position of power, the toys and status symbols that people can look at and think that we are someone? And what this is saying to us is that we all have our hope in something. For us, it may not be money. We might have realised that money is not where it's at. But we all have something that we treasure, something that we are hoping in the future for, the thing that we have got our future pinned to that is our security. And so having identified that treasure, I want to go on and ask the question, what do we actually do with that knowledge? If we have tested our treasure, we know what our treasure is there something wrong with having that treasure? We'll see the parable that Jesus goes on to tell from verse 16. He talks of a particular rich man. You'll notice in verse 16 that this man is rich not because of anything that he has done. No, it's because of the ground that has yielded an abundant harvest, this ground that he has. And very quickly, Jesus takes us to see what this man's treasure is. Verse 17. He thought to himself, what should I do? I have no place to store my crops. And then he said, this is what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones. And there I will store my surplus grain. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy. Eat, drink, and be merry. And it would seem that for this man, that idea of kind of having the safety and security of a kind of big pot of money, that's his hope, that's the thing that he's trusting in. But there's a few crucial things that I want us to observe from these words that this man speaks in the parable that Jesus tells. Firstly, do you notice verse 17, that these are the man's self-reflections. It's been said that your religion is what you do with your solitude, where your thoughts drift to in those moments where you have a bit of spare time. That is your treasure, the place where your thoughts and attentions naturally go. And the second thing to notice about what this man says, do you see it as you read these words of his? Do you see how self-focused he is in those self-reflections? Notice how many times he talks about himself. Verse 17, what shall I do? I have no place to store. They're my crops. He goes on, this is what I'll do. I will tear down my barns again, build bigger ones. I will store my surplus grain. And then he's saying to himself, very self-focused. And the great thing that this man has failed to reckon with is that God is part of the picture. Verse 20. But God said to him, you fool, this very night your life will be demanded of you, and then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? In all his self-focus, this man has failed to recognise that God is in the picture, that God exists, and that God is the one to whom he will have to give account. And see how Jesus ties all this together as he kind of summarises the point of the parable in verse 21. He says, this is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich towards God. Literally, Jesus says here in verse 21, this is how it will be for those who treasure things for themselves, but are not rich towards God. And Jesus in this verse here is drawing for us this fundamental dichotomy that operates in life. Either our treasure exists in this world, and if that is the case, then Jesus is saying that it will necessarily be a self-focused pursuit. It will be for ourselves. And the only other option that Jesus gives us is that we are being rich towards God. It is either one option or the other. It doesn't matter how noble our claims are, that the things that we are doing, the things that we are speaking and saying, what we're doing with our money, no matter how much we claim that it is for other people. Jesus says, if our actions are not an expression of richness towards God, then it will necessarily be an expression of focus on self. And the great problem with that is that it fails to account for the fact that God exists, that God is part of the picture, that God is the one who actually gives us everything that we have in this life. I mean, remember back to that man who was rich because of his ground that God had given him. It was nothing to do with him in the first place. And if we spend our life treasuring and storing up in this world, then in the end it will be nothing but trash, because it won't count a spot when it comes to the judgment day with God. And is this saying to us here that we're not to value ourselves? Is it saying that we're not to use our brains and save and think through the future? Does this mean that we should not invest? Well, I mean, those things have their place. But Jesus is wanting us to consider where our thoughts drift. You can see everyone cringing at the door. Went to bang. Jesus is challenging us to think through in those spare moments, in those moments on our beds at night, where do our thoughts go? What's our focus? What's our treasure? And he's trying to point out to us that wherever we find that our treasure is in this world, well, we are in great trouble on that day when God tells us that our time is up. Money and possessions, they cannot save a life. They have value for a very short period of time in this world, but they have no value at all for eternity. And I mean, I know for myself how tempting it is to store up treasure in this world. Whether it's those savings that we have for our kids, whether it's the possessions that we have. I mean, Jay and I have just recently purchased the camper trailer. It is very tempting to let your mind wander and think through what you could do with this camper trailer and the value that you could get out of it. And here very clearly, there's nothing wrong with having savings. There's nothing wrong with having the camper trailer. But where I find myself saying, I'll do this and that, and I'll purchase this, and I'll do this with that, and then I'll suddenly be in a position where I can sit back and take things easy, I'll have arrived. Well, that is the point where there is a great problem. And to be honest with you, the harder things for me to turn away from are those treasures in this world that I can justify to myself that they're actually for God, that they're actually for others. The service that I do as a pastor. It's very easy to think of those things and think of them as being done for God, and really when you trace it back, it's being done for the recognition at the end of it all. And friends, I would say to us in this, as we think about our treasure, as we think about how that treasure in God's sight, and when God is in the picture, it is actually trash, we need to be very careful that we don't get caught thinking, I'm going to sort this out tomorrow. I'm going to sort this out just in the next season. I'm just a bit too busy right now. I'll get through this current round of work, and then I'll sort things out between me and God. I'll pay off the house. I'll get my career established, and then I'll think about it. Well, friends, that's exactly what the man in Jesus' parable was doing. I'll build a bigger barn, I'll store up a bigger amount of resources, and then I'll be sweet for anything. Then I'll do whatever you want, everything will be fine. I just got to get to that point. Don't be deceived. That is not what we are to treasure in this life. And so we need to go on and think, what ought our treasure be? What does it mean when Jesus says in verse 21 there that we are to be rich towards God? What is that to look like? We'll see what he goes on and says to his disciples in verse 22. He says, "Therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat, or about your body, what you will wear." Jesus essentially says here, don't worry about yourself. And very quickly our hearts might respond and say, well, if I don't worry about myself, who's going to? We'll see how Jesus has a very ready answer for that. God. He goes on from verse 24 and he starts just looking around him. Look at the birds, he says in verse 24. In fact, he speaks of the ravens and the crows, a bird that in the first century was seen in first century Judaism as an unclean bird. And yet Jesus says, look at the crow. God provides for the crow. He goes on, verse 27. The wildflowers, which don't labour or toil, no one's there tending to them, no human person, and yet God clothes them beautifully. Verse 28, I think it is, where he talks about the grass, which is here today, and garden mulch tomorrow. Even God is concerned about the grass. And Jesus' argument is that if God can care for the animals, if he can care for the plants, he can care for you. Jesus summarises at verse 29. He says, "So do not set your heart on what you will eat or drink. Do not worry about it. For the pagan world runs after all such things, and your Father knows that you need them. But seek his kingdom, and these things will be given to you as well." You see, Jesus says to us, don't worry about all that stuff. No, but this is what you are to treasure. Do you see it in verse 31 there? Treasure his kingdom. Seek first God and his kingdom. Treasure God. And we might ask the question, what's a tangible example of what that might look like to treasure God? Well, Jesus gives us one. Verse 33, he says, "Sell your possessions and give to the poor. Provide purses for yourselves that will not wear out, a treasure in heaven that will never fail, where no thief comes near and no moth destroys." Jesus' example of treasuring God: sell your possessions, give to the poor. Give to the person who will never be able to repay you in this life. And then you can be sure that it's an action that has been done for God and not for yourself. And what Jesus is saying here is that our thoughts ought to be drifting towards thinking through God and his kingdom. Thinking through, what does God want me to be doing in my actions towards others? Instead of wanting wanting more, we're to want less. We're to be thinking through, what can I sell? What can I get rid of? How can I give things away? And what this is saying here, it's not telling us to give to the poor so that God might somehow owe us. Now, Jesus is saying that for the person on his team, they have come to realise who God truly is. That God is the one who owns everything. That everything that we have, it's come from him in the first place anyway. The person on Team Jesus has come to realise that God cares for them. That they have nothing left to fear or be worried about or be afraid of. I mean, as I've been thinking through Luke, even we were discussing it in Bible study this week, I mean, it's a wonderful picture of God that we get in these chapters. It's a picture of God as a giver. When you think about God, he owns everything. And his fundamental character is to give. I mean, thinking about us and us becoming like God, being freed by the knowledge of who God is as that giver, what would that look like for us to give to the poor? There's so many different ways you could apply that today. Compassion run a great sponsor child program. There's World Vision and TIER that do all their community development work around the world in countries that need it. I mean, as a pastor, I get calls from time to time of people who need help. If you're keen to be on a list that I could call up and try and meet some of those needs, I'd love you to chat to me. I'm sure that you get requests from time to time from people who are in need. But as you try and start thinking that through, as you get really tangible like that and think about it in connection to your life, we can very quickly begin thinking, well, how do I know that I won't end up with nothing? If I start doing that, what's the backstop? What's the security at the end of it all? How do you even start that kind of process? And of course, it's the same answer, isn't it? God's a giver. God cares for you. Trust him. And in fact, what you see for the Christian, the person who is on Team Jesus, they have the wonderful assurance that God has shown his care definitively in the past. Jesus, in verse 32, he says there, "Do not be afraid, little flock, for your Father has been pleased to give you the kingdom." I mean, this language that Jesus uses here, he's speaking as a shepherd to sheep. Little flock, he addresses them. And as you keep reading through Luke's Gospel, we'll come to this in a few weeks' time, in chapter 15, Jesus tells another parable. He speaks of another shepherd who leaves his 99 sheep and he goes chasing after the one lost sheep. And he rejoices when he finds that sheep. Well, Luke's Gospel, I mean, it's the story about Jesus, but it's also our story. Because you see, friends, we're that lost sheep. We are those who have received so much from God and yet who have gone astray from him and started finding our treasure in this world instead of finding our treasure in him. And as Jesus Christ comes down to the cross, as he pours out everything for us, he is showing us definitively that God cares. God cares for us. Jesus came into this world to show us that. And we can be totally confident that he is for us to the end, no matter what situation we confront. We are to turn towards the true treasure of God himself. And as I think of it as a parent trying to save up for our kids, the problem with that is that I have limited resources. But God doesn't. I can actually trust him for myself. I can actually trust God for my family. I can actually trust God for the whole world. I mean, do you see there in verse 32 how Jesus says that the Father has been pleased to give you the kingdom? God who owns everything. And he has said to all who would come to him through Christ, here you go, come and have it all. I want to share it out. I want to share it with you. I want to give. Friends, we need to look to God, don't we? We need to live our lives for him, obey him, pray to him when we're in trouble. We need to value him above all things else. When things get tough, keep looking to God. He is the only place of security that we will ever find. Don't worry about super and investment properties. We can be wise with those things, but don't obsess over it. Jesus is the only one who will see us through to the end. And we began this afternoon asking that question, what is the treasure for those who are on Team Jesus? We've seen that we're to test our treasure, test our hearts, to see what is going on within our hearts. We're to turn away from trash, the treasures of this world, and we are to turn towards the true treasure of God himself. And I would say to you this afternoon, if you're someone particularly who's maybe come here this afternoon as part of our open day service, we're really glad that you're here. But I would encourage you, if you've heard something this afternoon that's kind of interested you, you'd like to think more about what it might look like for you to treasure God in your life, well, I've got something I want to suggest during notices for you, but I'd also say to you, just come back next week. Come back as we continue this series through Team Jesus. Next week we'll be continuing to push that analogy of the kind of sports field. We'll be thinking through, for those who are on Team Jesus, what time is it in the game? Because whatever time it is in the game, that changes your actions, it changes your desperation. What time is it for those of us on Team Jesus? And so I encourage you, come back for that next week. But I'm going to pray now, and then we'll open it up for questions as we do here at Make. And so that's a chance to ask any question that you might have from this passage, from anything that I've said, any objections or concerns with what I've said. I'd love to hear that as well. But I'll lead us in prayer before that. Let's pray. Loving Father, we do thank you that as we come to you, we can know you as God who is a giver.